And today we're going to talk about nourished fasting and how that can really dramatically benefit the body. And so let's start by, breaking down for listeners that are new to fasting, what fasting actually does to our cells, organs, and ultimately the body as a whole.
Yeah, well, David, well, thank you so much for having me on your show here. Fasting is one of the most ancient traditions all around the globe, and so it might seem like a new trend, but in fact, every living organism on Earth has gone through fasting. Think about the days before refrigeration, agriculture, the food didn't come by easy. We had to go out and look for them, and from time to time, nature it hasn't always been kind. So there are always periods where there's not enough food. And so the body really has developed mechanism to cope with that. And there's actually more story than that because not only do we cope with that, the body actually has developed to turn that disadvantage of no food into an advantage. And allow me to explain a little bit. When there's no food, the body says, well, it's not time for growth, but it's actually time for rejuvenation. It's time where the body needs to kind of hunker down and clean up its internal mechanism, if you will. And so this is the time when the cells say, "Hey, what can I use to burn for as a source of energy?" And so you begin to look for things a little bit older, a little bit more worn out, and shoot it up as a source of energy until the food arrives again. And so by that process, the cells typically actually decrease in size because this process called autophagy, right, where it's self-eating to looking for energy to sustain itself until food becomes available again. That typically happens for a couple of days, and so you can imagine the cells will shrink by a little bit. But by the time food becomes available again, the cells is going to grow back by replacing those worn out parts with new parts and thereby completing that cycle of rejuvenation. I mean, just when you think about this, right? When nature doesn't have enough food for the body goes through this process. It's supposed to be really bad for you, but it turns out, you turn that disadvantage into advantage by actually now replacing parts of the older parts of the cells with new parts, and now the cells emerge healthier, stronger, and if in some sense younger than before. This is really the miracle of life.
Yeah, it's amazing and really it works with the cycles of life. Just like we have cycles like winter, spring, summer, fall, our ancestors had feast and famine seasons. When food was available, you ate and you ate well because the food was going to spoil. You didn't know when your next meal was going to come, so you ate well. And then obviously they had, times where they had a bad hunt or a bad harvest, right? And food wasn't available. And so they would just naturally go through these cycles of building and then break down and repair. And this is just built into our DNA. Now we have to be intentional about it because food is so prevalent, which is a positive thing. But now we have to realize, hey, we've got to kind of mimic some of the things that our ancestors were doing that gives us greater resilience in life.
All
And so
right.
fasting is one of those things. And there's so many people all around the world that are getting amazing health benefits utilizing intermittent fasting, extended fasting, and then also nourished fasting, which is what you guys have specialized in. And so let's talk about, different fasting strategies and of course, nourished fasting with the fasting mimicking diet.
When you think about interventions such as fasting, it's really, in my mind, a double-edged sword. And what I mean by that, when something that's good, but if you do it too much, it's always harmful, right? So think about, is it good to run marathon every single day? Of course not.
No.
It's too much, right? So you also have to train your body to leading up to that kind of long distance training. Same thing with fasting. Remember, fasting is a stress to the body, right? So because you're not getting the nourishment. And so what we are doing with fasting in terms of the body's adaptation, it's nothing short of miracle. We talked a little bit about it earlier, but when it's not done right, for example, when the fasting is too long, when it's too frequent, just remember starvation was never really meant to be good.
Mhm.
Starvation is not good, right?
No.
But now modern day folks, we've taken that to another extreme where we would avoid starvation at any cost, and that is just, we're eating too much, we're growing all the time, there's this growth signal coming from all this food all the time, 24/7 during our sort of awake moments. That's also not good. But remember the other side where there's not enough food, malnourishment, starvation is also not good. And so this is where even with exercise, as we mentioned earlier, there has to be a happy medium somewhere where you're getting just enough fasting, but also enough nourishment, right? That's got to be in the middle ground. And this is where the concept of fasting mimicking diet and Dr. Jockers, that you mentioned, nourished fast. I really love that term, right? The idea that how can we hack the physiology of the body so that we can get most of the benefits of fasting without the burden associated with fasting is what really underlies the fasting mimicking diet. And so maybe allow me to explain a little bit that concept. It sounds like initially like an oxymoron when you have what's a nourished fast. When you fast, most people say that means no food. How could there be food and fasting at the same time? Well, you can imagine that in order for on the behavior side, obviously, when you eat, you're not fasting, and that's a very simple term. But when you think about on the level of the cell, we have something called the cellular fasting. That means what is the condition by which the cells actually experience fasting? It's not the absence of all food, because there's always some nutrients flowing in the blood. Even when you're fasting, there's always glucose level. I mean, the glucose level never drops to zero. Yeah, you'll be dead, right? So, for example, glucose level during fasting could be 75, could be 80 milligram per deciliter. There's always some nutrients. So from the cell's perspective, is not the absolute absence of food that defines fasting, but rather, is there a level of nutrients under which there is no signal for nutrition? So now we understand, as we look at the cells, there are these eyes and ears and nose of we call the receptors inside the cells or on the surface of the cells that picks up the scent, the signals from protein molecules, from amino acids, from glucose. So, and there's always a threshold, almost like the thermostat in our house, right? You don't turn on the thermostat until a temperature reaches a certain level. Below the temperature, you actually don't trigger the thermostat. You don't trigger that heater or AC. So the same thing with the cells, right? These receptors have a certain set point. If you provide food underneath, if you provide the amount of food that's below these thresholds, then the cells actually says there's not enough nutrients for me to perceive it as nutrients coming in. In that sense, you could actually provide nutrients at the same time mimic fasting. So you provide just enough nutrition to support this journey of fasting, but at the same time, you're getting the benefits of prolonged fast. That is the secret of the fasting mimicking diet.
Yeah, when we talk about those nutrient sensing pathways, some of the ones that are most well researched are your mTOR, or mammalian target of rapamycin pathway, and your IGF-1, insulin-like growth factor 1, and of course, just insulin in general. So those would be your three, I guess you could say, most well researched. There's a number of other factors involved, but those are the three that probably are the most researched and most discussed in the longevity space and natural health space. And so those are the ones that we're looking to suppress, basically, or to keep under that key threshold, right, where they're triggering they're changing the physiology of the body when they're triggered. And so can you briefly explain mTOR, IGF-1, insulin, what their jobs are and what they do?
Yeah, so essentially, these what we call receptors, these are nutrient sensing pathways. What they are is they tell the body what to do when in the presence of a lot of nutrients. So you can imagine every day we need certain nutrients to grow. And when you're a baby or when you're a teenager, you're constantly growing.
Mm-hmm.
But certainly when we reach adulthood, there's a certain maintenance we have to do because the cells die, you have to replace them, but certainly not at the same level when we are a teenager or a baby.
Yeah.
Now, our challenge comes when these nutrient sensors are always activated in our society. As you mentioned earlier, we have so much food that in fact, as a society, we just overeat from morning till night, other than the time we're eating. Okay. And so that constant signal of growth through these nutrient sensing pathways, resulting many of the age related conditions, to chronic conditions like diabetes, obesity, and hypertension, and others, because there's simply too much growth signal. Now, also, when you think about growth, in our society, that sounds like that's a very positive term. We are growing. The problem is when you are already a society when there's 70% overweight. I mean, how much more growth do we need? And when there's too much growth in the liver, for example, we call that fatty liver. Well, when there's too much fat in the belly, we call that central obesity. And when all these things happen together, I mean, then we have metabolic syndrome, we have prediabetes, and then it's prediabetes. So there is downside to growth. Remember, there's always a happy medium here. When there's too much activation of these nutrient sensors, it leads to the start of many of these age-related conditions and chronic conditions that we call metabolic syndrome. On the other hand, a lot of people may not realize this, that is, when there's too much growth signals, it also accelerates aging pathways. Because you can imagine, for example, let's say you have a sports car, you love putting the pedal to the metal to the pedal, maybe the pedal to the metal, right? So all the way down, what happens? You arrive your destination faster, but at what expense? Look at the tread on your tire. I mean, it gets worn out. So as one of the side effects of all this growth signal is that the body is growing too fast. And so it really activates aging pathways. And that's exactly what we don't want to see in a society where, we may live a little longer, but the problem is we're getting diseases much earlier in our lives. So the idea of health span is decreasing, even though we can use modern medicine to keep life, so to keep going. But the problem is the amount of time we stay in healthy range becomes shorter and shorter. And that's a huge cost that we're paying now.